As promised, in our study today, we are going to discuss the great controversy and Daniel 11. Now, when I say the great controversy, I'm not speaking in general terms. I'm referring to the book, The Great Controversy, by Ellen White, as it relates to Daniel chapter 11. And as we begin our study, I would like to remind you that in the book of Daniel, we have four prophetic outlines. Four prophetic outlines which cover similar material. Not identical, but similar. They follow the same sequence. Those four outlines are Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, and Daniel chapter 11. Basically, they follow the same sequence of powers and events. And so if we want to understand fully what has happened and what is going to take place in the future, we need to compare these four prophetic outlines and include all of the material together so that we might catch a complete view. You see, Daniel 2 gives us one perspective. Daniel 7 gives us an additional perspective. Daniel 8 gives us still another. And Daniel chapter 11 completes the cycle. But each outline has details which the other outlines doesn't have. And so we need to study all four of them and then put all of the material together. So as we begin, I would remind you once again that Daniel has four prophetic outlines. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Daniel 11. Actually, you could say Daniel 8 through 10 and Daniel 11 through 12. But the outline itself is in Daniel 8 and in Daniel 11. Now, another very important point that we need to remember is that in Daniel chapter 7, the last power, the last human power which will rule on this earth is the little horn. We noticed that, didn't we? The little horn has two stages. One during the 1260 years, Revelation 13 says its wound will be healed, and after its wound is healed, it's going to rule the world, and finally it's destroyed when Jesus comes. So the last human power, the last human kingdom on planet Earth in Daniel 7 is the little horn. Now in Daniel chapter 8, the last human kingdom is also a little horn. We're going to notice that in a few moments. The little horn represents the same thing as the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. In Revelation chapter 13, the last power is the beast. You might say, well, wait a minute. The second beast that arises from the earth, that is the last power. But we need to remember that that beast which arises from the earth has primarily one purpose, and that is to give the power back to the first beast. In other words, the second beast does not rule by itself. Its purpose is not to rule the world itself, but to use its clout to restore the power to the beast. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Everything that this second beast does, it does with reference to the first beast. It makes an image to the first beast. It enforces the mark of the first beast. It commands the whole world to worship the first beast. In other words, this second beast does not actually globally rule the world on its own, but it does it with the purpose of restoring the power to the first beast. Now, we've already noticed that this beast of Revelation 13 is the same as the little horn. Remember we studied that last night? They have the same characteristics. They persecute the saints. They speak blasphemies against the Most High. They rule during the same period of time. You remember we studied that? And so the beast is the last human power, according to Revelation 13. The little horn is the last human power, according to Daniel 8. The little horn is the last human power in the world, according to Daniel chapter 7. And if we add 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we discover that the last power, which will be destroyed at the coming of Christ, is the man of sin. And we already noticed that the man of sin is parallel to the little horn and to the beast of Revelation chapter 13. So basically what I'm trying to underline here is that the last power on planet Earth, human power which will govern, will be which? The Roman Catholic papacy. That is the little horn. That is the beast. That is the man of sin, as we've studied. Now, once again, I emphasize that there are many wonderful, loving Roman Catholics in the Roman Catholic communion. I'm not saying that Roman Catholics are bad. What I'm saying is that this system is the Antichrist system of Bible prophecy. The hierarchy, in other words, the organizational structure as such, is the Antichrist, is the beast, is the little horn, is the little man of sin. And this is the last power which will rule on planet Earth in all of these prophecies. And of course, we could add the abomination of desolation in Matthew chapter 24, and we could add the harlot of Revelation 17 also, which we have not studied in this particular series. But I could show you that the abomination of desolation and the harlot also represent this same human system, which will rule at the very end of time. Now, in Daniel chapter 11, the very last power which will rule the world will be a power known as the King of the North. Now, who do you suppose that power would represent, the King of the North? Turkey? Come on. You say, how can it be Turkey? If in Daniel 7, it's the Roman Catholic papacy. In Daniel 8, it's the Roman Catholic papacy. In Revelation chapter 13, it's the Roman Catholic papacy. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it's the Roman Catholic papacy, the last power that rules upon the world. Then let me ask you, what must be the King of the North, the last power which will rule this earth according to Daniel 11? How many last powers can you have? You have one last power. So the King of the North must be what? Must be the same power as the little horn, the beast, and the man of sin, following historicist principles, the historical flow method, as I choose to describe it. Now, I need to tell you a few things about Daniel chapter 8 through chapter 12, and we won't be able to go into this with a lot of detail. I've written actually a document titled, What is the Little Book of Daniel 8 through 12? And I show there that Daniel 8 through 12 is a unit in itself. In other words, Daniel 8 through 12 must be studied separately from the rest of the book. It's related to the rest of the book, but it is a book within a book, so to speak. And actually, everything in Daniel 8 through 12 is related to the 2300 days. Now, I'm going to describe Daniel chapter 8 very quickly, and then I want to go also to Daniel chapter 11 and show you that Daniel 11 is parallel to Daniel 8. In Daniel 8, you have two beasts. One of those beasts is a ram, and the ram has two horns. Have you ever read about that ram, which has two horns? Now, let me ask you, what does that ram represent? What kingdom does the ram represent? The chapter itself tells us. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20 says that the ram represents the Medes and the Persians. Then after that, you have a he-goat. And the he-goat attacks the ram, breaks its horns, and the he-goat has a notable horn on its head, which is identified as its first king. Let me ask you, what does the he-goat represent in Daniel chapter 8? It's clearly identified in verse 21 of chapter 8. It says that the he-goat with the notable horn represents Greece, and the horn represents its first king. Now let me ask you, who was the first king? The first king of the Greek dynasty at this period of Greece was Alexander the Great. But then the great horn was broken, and out of the head of this beast, of this he-goat, rise four horns toward the four winds of heaven. In other words, Greece was going to be divided into how many kingdoms? Greece was going to be divided into four kingdoms. And then as you continue reading Daniel chapter 8, you discover that after Greece, with the horns, you have a little horn which rises and rules over the earth. Now, it's interesting, the little horn of Daniel chapter 8 represents both the period of pagan Rome and papal Rome. In other words, it's one symbol for both stages of Rome, because after all, it is Rome. Rome is Rome. Whether it's political Rome or ecclesiastical Rome, they are still Rome. They have the same capital, they use the same language, they use the same numeral system, and basically the Roman Catholic Church inherited the organizational structure of the Roman Empire, only they changed the names of the leaders of the empire. And so in Daniel chapter 8, you have a little horn, just like you have in Daniel chapter 7 after Greece. Are you following me so far? And then you'll notice in Daniel chapter 8 that this horn is doing all sorts of nasty things, just like the little horn in Daniel chapter 7. And then Daniel hears two angels that are speaking in heaven. And one says, how long is it going to be until this little horn is taken care of, until God does something about this little horn, who blasphemes the Most High, who tramples the saints of the Most High, does many of the things that the little horn of Daniel 7 did? How long is it going to be until this little horn is judged? And the answer comes, unto 2,300 days, and the sanctuary shall be what? And the sanctuary shall be cleansed, or the sanctuary shall be restored. Actually, it's talking about the judgment. In its context, it's speaking primarily of the judgment that God is going to perform against whom? Against the little horn for what the little horn has done. Now in Daniel 7, if we notice Daniel 7, we'll see that the little horn was brought before God's court immediately after saying that it blasphemed God, and it persecuted the saints of the Most High, and it thought it could change times and laws, and it governed for 1,260 years, for times and the dividing of time. Then it speaks about Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven to the Father to begin the judgment. And it says that judgment was given in favor of the saints of the Most High and against the little horn. In Daniel 8, we have the same thing. The little horn does its nasty work, and then unto 2,300 days, and the judgment will begin to judge this little horn. And then the time comes when God's people are going to inherit the kingdom. But now there's something very interesting in Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 is an incomplete chapter. Because even though Daniel hears these two angels speaking, and he hears unto 2,300 days, and the sanctuary shall be cleansed, actually, as we've studied previously, Daniel did not understand the meaning of the 2,300 days. He knew that the 2,300 days were actually what? Years. You see, he felt that God was going to extend the 70 years of captivity. He says, God said that we're going to be 70 years, and then the sanctuary is going to be restored. But now he's saying 2,300 days or 2,300 years and the sanctuary will be restored. He says, I can't understand the 70 years as they relate to the 2,300 years. And so in Daniel chapter 9, he begins praying to the Lord. He says, Lord, please give me understanding. Maybe our sins are so great. Maybe Israel has gone so far astray from you that you've decided that 70 years of punishment isn't enough. You've decided to extend the period to 2,300 years. And Daniel is praying to God. He says, don't delay. In chapter 9 and verse 19, he says, please, Lord, don't delay. And then, of course, Gabriel is sent back in Daniel chapter 9. And he says to Daniel, 70 weeks are cut off for your people and your holy city. Cut off from where? Cut off from the larger prophecy of the 2,300 years. In other words, the first 490 years of the prophecy of the 2,300 days applies to the literal Jewish nation. And as we've studied, that period began when? From the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, which is 457 BC. And it takes us to what date? 34 AD, when Stephen was stoned. So the first segment of the 2,300 days are the 490 years, which are mentioned by Gabriel and explained by Gabriel in Daniel chapter 9. Let me ask you then, does Daniel 9 bear a very close relationship to Daniel chapter 8? Of course. You see, at the end of chapter 8, Daniel, when he hears about the 2,300 days or years, you can read it in the last verse, verse 27 of chapter 8, he gets sick. The angel is not able even to finish the explanation of what 2,300 days means. And so the explanation is suspended. But in chapter 9, Daniel is praying for understanding, and Gabriel is sent, and Gabriel gives him understanding. And he says, the 2,300 days will begin with the going forth of the word to build, to restore, and to build Jerusalem. That's when the 2,300 days will begin. The first 490 years are the first segment of the 2,300 years. Are you understanding what I'm saying? So Daniel 9 provides the beginning date for the 2,300 days of Daniel chapter 8. So is Daniel 9 related to Daniel 8? Most certainly, yes. It gives us the starting point for the 2,300 days or the 2,300 years. You see, God wouldn't say unto 2,300 days and the sanctuary would be cleansed and then not give any beginning point for the 2,300 days. He'd say, well, you just guess when they start. No. In Daniel 9, God gives us the starting point. It's when the command is given to restore and to build Jerusalem. 457 BC. Now what about Daniel 10? Is Daniel 10 related to the 2,300 days? It most certainly is. In Daniel 10, basically what you have is a battle. There is a power which is known as the Prince of Persia, which if you read Daniel chapter 10, you'll see very clearly that it is a reference to Satan. He's working behind the scenes upon the minds of the kings of Persia to keep them from giving the decree which will lead to the fulfillment of the 70 weeks. Basically, what the devil is doing, he's trying to influence the kings of Persia, telling them, don't let those people go. Don't let them go back to their city. Don't let them go back to establish their religion. Why would the devil want to keep the Persian kings from giving the decrees to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city and to restore the city? Because if that is not fulfilled, the 70 weeks will not what? The 70 weeks and the 2,300 days will not begin according to schedule. And so there's this battle going on between the Prince of Persia and Gabriel, two angelic beings. And do you know that this Prince of Persia is so powerful that Gabriel is not able to prevail against him? And so it says there in the last part of Daniel chapter 10 that Michael, the great prince, one of the great princes, comes and he helps Gabriel in his struggle with the Prince of Persia. And as a result, the kings of Persia give the decrees that will make the fulfillment of the 70 weeks and the 2,300 days possible. Are you following me so far? Yes or no? Is Daniel chapter 10 related to Daniel 9 and related to Daniel 8? Of course. See, Daniel 8 introduces the 2,300 days, gives no beginning date, because Daniel got sick. So in Daniel 9, God says, I'm going to tell you when the 2,300 days begin. From the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. That's when they start. And there's going to be 490 years which will apply to the Jews. That belongs to your city and it belongs to your people. In Daniel chapter 10, you have the struggle between Gabriel, which by the way took the place of Lucifer, and Satan, the prince of Persia, Gabriel trying to convince the kings of Persia to give the decrees which will fulfill the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and the prince of Persia, Satan, trying to get them to go against and not give the decrees. But of course, it says there that Michael, along with Gabriel, prevail, and the decrees are given right on schedule. Now we've come to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11 begins at the same place where Daniel 8 began. Are you with me? You know, unfortunately, we can't read every single verse. What I'm trying to do this evening is give you a global view. You know, I have 20 tapes in a series I did on Daniel, just on Daniel 11. And so how do you cover probably 25 hours of material in 1 hour? It's impossible. So all I can do is give you a global view. By the way, those tapes are available from Secrets Unsealed. If some of you feel really ambitious and you want to sit down, it's not the type of thing that you want to put in your cassette player if you're driving down the highway. You have to have your Bible with you, and you have to have your study and resource materials, your notebook, and you have to be able to stop and return the tape and listen again to make sure that you're catching everything that I'm saying, because it's a very intensive, very in-depth study of Daniel chapter 11. But what I want you to see this evening is the global view. If you read Daniel chapter 11, you're going to discover that it begins at the same spot that Daniel 8 began. Daniel 8 began with which kingdom? The ram, with the Medes and Persians. It continued with which kingdom? With Greece. And then Greece was divided into what? Into 4 kingdoms. Let me show you that. Daniel chapter 11. We'll read these verses. Daniel chapter 11, and I want to start reading at verse 2. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up, by the way, stand up means begin to rule, begin to reign, shall stand up yet 3 kings, where? In Persia. So when Daniel 11 begins, it begins in which kingdom? In Persia. And the 4th, that is the 4th king of Persia, shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all nations against the realm of Grecia. If I had time, I would show you that this 4th king is Artaxerxes the first, who gave the decree to restore and build Jerusalem. Interesting that it would begin with this very king. Now notice verse 3. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. This is speaking about the same as a notable horn on the he-goat. Verse 4. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the what? Toward the 4 winds of heaven. Is that the same as the 4 horns that came up from the head of the he-goat? Yes. So did you begin with Persia in Daniel 11? Absolutely. Did you continue with Greece in Daniel 11? Yes. Now I want to show you that the next kingdom is Rome. Unfortunately, I can only pick and choose certain verses that show you the sequence. We can't study everything in between. It would take us at least 5 or 6 sessions just to study all of the historical details that are mentioned in this chapter. Notice Daniel chapter 11 and verse 22. You tell me which kingdom this is now. You've noticed that it starts with Persia. It continues with Greece. Greece is divided into 4. Which kingdom would you expect to be next? You would expect Rome to be next, right? The Empire of Rome. Now notice chapter 11 and verse 22. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown from before him, and shall be broken. Yea, also the what? The Prince of the Covenant. Who is the Prince of the Covenant? The Prince of the Covenant is Jesus. And it says here that the Prince of the Covenant was going to be what? Was going to be broken. Now let me ask you, when was Jesus broken according to Bible prophecy? He was broken when the Empire of Rome crucified him by instigation of the Hebrew nation. In other words, in Daniel 11 and verse 22, where are we in the sequence? In the sequence, we are at Rome. Now, which would you expect the next stage to be? Let's just guess. What would be the next stage? Well, it must be papal Rome. During which period? During the 1260 years, correct? Now, let's go to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11, and let's read starting, I wish we could go all the way from verse 30, because verse 30 actually begins this last power. It says in verse 36, and the king, the same as the little horn, same as the man of sin, same as the harlot, same as the abomination of desolation, same as the beast, only here he's called what? He's called the king. And the king shall do according to his will. And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. Where did we see that expression somewhere before? Do you remember that we studied that phrase? Where is it? It's in Daniel 7, but it's more specifically in another place. He shall exalt himself. He shall sit in the temple of God, showing himself that he is what? God. Where is that? 2 Thessalonians 2. In fact, the Apostle Paul, when he talks about the man of sin, is quoting this verse. Are you with me or not? Who is the man of sin? We've studied this. It's the papacy. So who must this power be? The same. And so it says, he shall do according to his will. and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak what? Marvelous things against the God of gods. Is that what the little horn did? Yes or no? Of course. And shall prosper. Is that what happened to the little horn for 1260 years? Did things go well for him? Absolutely. Shall prosper. Till the indignation be accomplished. This is speaking about God's punishment. This is speaking about the pouring out of the 7 last plagues. Until the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. That is the God of the fathers of the church. In other words, the apostles, the God of the apostles. Nor the desire of women. This is a reference to the practice of celibacy in the church. If I had time, I would go into that in more detail. It continues saying, for he shall magnify himself above all. Verse 38, but in his estate shall he honor the God of forces. The God of force. In other words, it's speaking about him joining the political systems, the secular powers of the world. And you can check this out in the tapes. I have a lot of information to show that the God of forces is the God of politics, the God of the secular, the civil systems of the world. And so it says, but in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and precious stones. Same reference as in Revelation 17, where the harlot has these same things, and pleasant things. Verse 39, thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. This is a reference to what the papacy did during the Middle Ages. They bought and they sold estates. They sold church offices and lands and bishoprics and so on. Now, what power are these verses describing? By the characteristics, exalting himself above God, speaking marvelous things against God, exalting himself above all, and so on, we know that it's the same as the little horn, and this power is the same as the man of sin. It's the last power which is going to rule the world. Are you with me so far? So where has Daniel 11 taken us? Has it taken us over the same ground as Daniel 8? Do you have Persia in both? Yes. Do you have Greece in both? Yes. Do you have Rome in both? Do you have papal Rome in both? Yes, you do. Now, allow me to make a short parenthesis here. Let me talk about Ellen White. Did you know that Ellen White never quotes a single verse or phrase in Daniel 11:40 to 45? That's interesting. Ellen White never quotes. She never even alludes to a single phrase in Daniel 11:40 to 45. And somebody says, well, then Ellen White must have been silent about the identity of the King of the North. My question is, was she really silent about the identity of the King of the North, who the King of the North represented, this last power, or did she have clearly in mind who this power was? Well, the fact is that Ellen White does not refer to Daniel 11 very frequently in her writings. She refers to Daniel 11 probably 3 or 4 times, and in 3 of these references, it's a very general statement about the prophecy of Daniel 11 almost being fulfilled. But there is one passage that Ellen White quotes from Daniel chapter 11. And I'd like to read that passage. It is found in Manuscript Releases, volume 13, page 394. She actually quotes Daniel 11:30 to 36. Now notice what she says. We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon, the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. Now notice this. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. According to Ellen White, has Daniel 11 mostly been fulfilled already in her day when she wrote this? Yes, because she says the prophecy of Daniel of the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. In other words, we are in the final stages of the fulfillment of Daniel 11. Do you think that might be verses 40 to 45? I don't think so. I know so. She continues saying, listen to this, much of the history that has taken place in the fulfillment of this prophecy. Are there some things from this prophecy that have already been fulfilled, according to her? Yes. She says, much of the history that has taken place in the fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. So many of the scenes that took place in the past are going to be what? Are going to be repeated. Now, which parts are going to be repeated? Well, notice that she says this. In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. She's quoting Daniel 11 and verse 30. And then she quotes Daniel 11, 31 to 36. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but she's actually quoting Daniel 11, 30 to 36. Let me ask you, according to Ellen White, have these scenes already been fulfilled in this passage, yes or no? Being that that was a very weak yes, I will read it again. She says, much of the history that has taken place in the fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And then she quotes Daniel chapter 11, verses 31 to 36. Then she says this, scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. Have these things been fulfilled already in the mind of Ellen White? In the past? Yes. Does she say that many of these scenes will be repeated? Yes. I'm going to explain in a minute why. She then says this, we see evidence that Satan is fast obtaining the control of human minds who have not the fear of God before them. Let all read and understand the prophecies of this book, for we are now entering upon the time of trouble spoken of. And then she quotes Daniel chapter 12 and verses 1 to 4. So for her, Daniel 12, 1 to 4 is future, whereas Daniel 11, verses 30, 36 are in the what? In the past. Now, when she says that Daniel 11, 30 to 36 is in the past, is she talking about the past history of the Medes and Persians? Do you think? No, because that's in Daniel 11, where? Verse 2. Is she talking about the history of Greece? Is she? No, that's in verses 3 and 4. Is she talking about the history of the Empire of Rome? No, that's in verse 22. She's quoting verses 30 to 36. What power is being spoken of in verses 30 to 36? It's the last power that governed during the 1260 years, because you have Persia, Greece, the Empire of Rome, which broke the Prince of the Covenant, and then you have, starting with verse 30, this power that ruled during the 1260 years, who is described like the man of sin, and is described like the little horn. Raise your hand if you're understanding what I'm saying. That was weak. But I'll forgive you. It's been a long day. Now you say, why does Ellen White say that these scenes will be repeated? It's very simple. It's not that the verses are going to be repeated. The scenes that took place in the past are going to be similar to what's going to take place in the future. Do you know why? Because the power that did all of these things in the past is going to resurrect from its wound, and it's going to rule again. Are you with me? In other words, Daniel 11, 30 to 39 is not going to be fulfilled again. What's going to happen is because the same power that ruled during that period is going to resurrect once again from the deadly wound that it received. It is going to behave the way that it did at that time in Europe, only at the end of time it's going to be on a global scale. Are you understanding me? Yes. Good. Now, we need to go to Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. Ellen White does not quote any verse from Daniel 11:40 to 45. So some people say Ellen White didn't have anything to say about Daniel 11:40 to 45. Not so fast. Does Ellen White understand which power is being spoken of in the verses before Daniel 11 verse 40? Does she know what power it's talking about? Yes. Now we need to go to Daniel 12 and verse 1, which comes after the verses that she doesn't quote. See, we studied the verses before. She identifies that as the period of papal power. She skips Daniel 11:40 to 45. Doesn't say anything about those verses, but then we need to ask, does she have anything to say about Daniel 12 and verse 1? And the answer is yes. She has several quotations of Daniel 12 and verse 1. First of all, let's read Daniel 12 and verse 1. It says there, and there are 3 points that I want us to notice from this verse, and at that time shall Michael stand up. What does the expression "at that time" indicate? Is there any connection with the previous verse? Any connection with the previous passage? What do you think? If it starts at that time, you say, which time? It has to be the time which has just been discussed in the previous chapter. At that time, Michael shall stand up. That's the first event that I want you to notice. At that time, Michael shall stand up. By the way, that means he will begin to reign. Have you ever read in the Spirit of Prophecy where Ellen White says that Jesus is going to change from his priestly robes to his kingly robes? People say, where did Ellen White get that from? We need to learn to use our heads. See, Ellen White doesn't say things that aren't in the Bible. The trouble is we're too lazy to find them in the Bible. Let me ask you, how is Jesus garbed today? According to the book of Hebrews, he's garbed or he's dressed as a high priest. How is Jesus garbed when he comes the second time? Revelation 19 says that he's garbed as a king. Now, if now he's garbed as a priest, and when he comes he's garbed as a king, he must have changed at some point. And he begins to rule when probation closes. Is that when Jesus begins to reign? When probation closes? Yes. And so it says, at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be, here's the second point, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. Is there a sequence in this verse? Michael stands up, begins to rule, then what comes after that? After that comes a what? A time of trouble. And then notice it says, at that time, which time? At the conclusion of the what? No. At the end of the what? Of the time of trouble. It's just talked about the time of trouble. It says, at that time, at the time of trouble, what will happen? Thy people shall be what? Delivered. The question is, delivered from whom? Delivered from this last power. We're going to notice it in a minute. At that time, thy people shall be delivered. Everyone that shall be found what? Everyone that shall be found written in the book. Do you see a sequence here? There's 3 events in Daniel 12 and verse 1. First event, Michael stands up. Which, by the way, in Daniel 11 verse 2, it says 3 kings will yet stand up in Persia. That means that 3 kings will still rule in Persia. So stand up means to rule. Daniel 11 itself explains it. So the first event in Daniel 12 and verse 1 is that Jesus will begin to what? To rule. And then when he stands up to rule, what is going to take place? The time of trouble. And when the time of trouble is transpiring, what is going to happen? God's people will eventually be what? Delivered from the time of trouble and from their enemies, Everyone who is found what? Written in the book. Is this clear in your mind? Now, we need to relate Daniel 12 and verse 1 with Daniel 11, 40 to 44 and 45. I'm going to do a little parallel now. Daniel 11, verse 44. It says here, and we're going to come back to this in a moment. It says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. In other words, it's going to trouble. There's going to be some news from the north and from the east that is going to trouble the king of the north, this last power. And what is he going to do as a result? Therefore, he shall go forth with what? With great fury. What is it that gives him great fury? The tidings from the north and from the east trouble him. They shake him up. That's a good translation. They shake him up. And he goes out as a result with great fury to destroy and utterly make away many. By the way, that's parallel in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 with the standing up of Michael. Verse 45, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas, and actually the King James has a bad translation. It is between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. The glorious holy mountain is what? Zion. And what city is there? Jerusalem. And by the way, this word seas here is a poetic plural which refers to the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is referred to in the poetic portions of the Old Testament with the plural seas, because big seas were not spoken of as sea, but as seas. In other words, this power is going to set up the tents of his palace between the Mediterranean and Jerusalem. You say, well, that sounds pretty literal. Do you actually think that this battle is going to take place in the Middle East? What is Jerusalem today? Where is Jerusalem today, according to what we've studied? Who is Israel today? Israel is what? Worldwide. What is Babylon, who wants to destroy Israel? It's a worldwide system. So this valley between the seas and the holy, glorious mountain, is that a literal place? No. It's referring to the wicked in the world gathering against God's righteous people where? Everywhere in the world where they're found. And why does he set the tents of his palace there? Because he wants to what? He's filled with fury, and he wants to what? He wants to destroy God's people. That is parallel to the time of trouble of Daniel 12 and verse 1. Are you following me or not? But then it says, in verse 45, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. That is parallel to the part in Daniel 12 verse 1 where it says, at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Are you following me? So Daniel 12 and verse 1 is actually describing the three stages or three events of Daniel 11 verses 44 and 45. Daniel 11:44 first of all says that tidings from the east and the north will trouble him, and he will go out to what? To destroy God's people. And when he goes out to destroy God's people, at that time, what is Jesus going to do? Jesus is going to stand up in favor of his people, it says here in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. Then it says that the king of the north plants the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. In other words, he surrounds spiritual Israel to what? With the intention of destroying it. And that is parallel to the time of trouble such as never has been seen of Daniel 12 and verse 1. And in Daniel 11:45, where it says that the king of the north comes to his end with none to help him, is parallel in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, where it says God's people will be what? Will be delivered from his power. Everyone who is found what? Everyone who is found written in the book. Now we need to go back to Ellen White. So far, so good? Now we need to go back to Ellen White. Because I said that Ellen White does quote Daniel 12 and verse 1. Is she clear about Daniel 11:30 to 39? Yes, that's the period of the first period of papal supremacy. Now you say, what about what happens after verses 40 to 45? Does she have anything to say? Ellen White actually quotes Daniel 12 and verse 1, and let me tell you where she quotes it. This verse, Daniel 12 and verse 1, she quotes to begin the chapter in the great controversy titled The Time of Trouble. In fact, at the very beginning of the chapter on the time of trouble, she quotes Daniel 12 and verse 1. Before she makes any commentary, she actually quotes Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. Now, what's particularly interesting is that after she quotes Daniel 12 and verse 1, she describes the time of trouble, how all of the wicked will gather against God's people, how the faith of God's people will be severely tested, how they will be thrown in prison, how they will be persecuted. None will die, she says, but they will suffer hunger and they will suffer thirst. And some will be abandoned in prison, apparently abandoned, forsaken by God. She says their faith will be severely tested. She describes the terrible time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, according to the way the Bible describes it. You know, it's interesting that after the chapter on the time of trouble, do you know what the next chapter in Ellen White's book, The Great Controversy, is titled? God's People Delivered. Now, wait a minute. What does that bring to mind? She's spoken about the time of trouble. She's speaking about God's people delivered. Is she still in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1? Yes, she is. And do you know what's interesting? Let me give you the pages. The page where she begins with the time of trouble is page 613 of Great Controversy. The place where she begins the chapter, God's People Delivered, the title is page 635. That's a long chapter on the time of trouble. And then, interestingly enough, on page 637, immediately after speaking about the deliverance of God's people, Ellen White quotes Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, where it speaks about many who rest in the dust of the earth will be raised, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting contempt. Does Ellen White quote Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1? Is she clear on Daniel 12 and verse 1? She sure is. In fact, when she quotes Daniel 12 and verse 1, on page 613, she not only begins with Daniel 12 and verse 1, but she actually, the first page describes how Jesus changes his priestly garments to his royal garments, and now how Jesus is now going to take his kingdom. He's going to reign. And then she describes the time of trouble. There she's discussing the standing up of Michael. She discusses the time of trouble, and then she speaks about the deliverance of God's people on page 635. Does Ellen White have very clear in mind the meaning of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1? Yes, she does. Does she have very clear in mind the meaning of Daniel 11:30 to 39? Yes, but now we have this problem. Ellen White does not quote Daniel 11:40 to 45. Now here's the million-dollar question. Where would you expect to find Ellen White's comments on Daniel 11:40 to 45? Where would you expect to find them? Hello? Anybody out there? Let's put our thinking caps on. Next chapter after which one? Why would she put that? That would reverse the order. Daniel 11:40 to 45 is before Daniel 12:1. Hello? Where would you expect Ellen White's comments on Daniel 11:40 to 45? She's already identified 30 to 39 as the papacy during the 1260 years. She's already identified the standing up of Jesus to close the door of probation, the time of trouble, and the deliverance of God's people, and the special resurrection of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2. Where would you expect her to make her comments on Daniel 11:40 to 45? It must be in the chapters immediately preceding the chapter on the time of trouble. You're not with me, are you? Yeah or no? Well, let me repeat it again. If she's commenting Daniel 12 and verse 1 in Great Controversy, page 613, that whole chapter that begins on page 613, that's 12:1. But she doesn't say anything apparently on Daniel 11:40 to 45. Where would you expect her to find her comments on Daniel 11:40 to 45? It would have to be in the chapters immediately preceding her quoting Daniel 12:1. Are you with me now? Yes, and the question is, what do you find in Ellen White's book, The Great Controversy, before Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1? Before I answer that question, there are two things that I want to cover. Number one, I want to read a quotation from Louis F. Weir, who wrote a book called The King of the North at Jerusalem. Very, very good book, where he establishes an important principle that we've spoken about before. He says this: when passing over into the Christian era, there is an automatic transition from literal to spiritual Babylon, from literal to spiritual Jerusalem, from literal lands of Israel and Babylon to their spiritual antitypes. Do you understand what she's saying? She's saying now that Babylon is no longer that literal place over in Iraq. She's saying that Jerusalem is no longer that city over there in the Middle East. She's saying that Babylon is spiritual and worldwide. And that Jerusalem is spiritual and worldwide, because Jerusalem is composed of Israelites, and Israelites are those who have joined Jesus, and those who have joined Jesus are all over the world. That's what Louis Weir is saying, and Ellen White is applying the same principle. In other words, we get rid of the geographical limitations that are given in the passage, and we apply the spiritual meaning of these geographical locations. Now let me describe some interesting details about the sequence of events in Daniel 11, and I'm going to have to do this very quickly. In Daniel 11, it speaks about, at the time of the end, the king of the south pushes at the king of the north. That word pushes means to attack with horns. It's the same word that is used in Daniel 8 where the he-goat is trying to gouge the ram with his horn. In other words, he wants to destroy him. So is there going to be a power at the time of the end who's going to try and destroy the king of the north? Absolutely. But then it says that the king of the north rises against the king of the south like a tempest. In fact, it says that he overflows and passes over. He enters even into the glorious land. By the way, the glorious land is Israel. But remember that we're dealing here with what? We're dealing here with symbolic language. We're not dealing with the literal Jerusalem. We're dealing with spiritual Jerusalem. He enters the glorious land. And when he enters the glorious land, which, by the way, the glorious land today would represent the what? The church. The worldwide church, the Christian church. It says that some escape from the hands of the king of the north when he enters and conquers the glorious land. But it also says that others fall into his hands. Don't forget this. This is important. Then it says that he will go out to utterly destroy and make away many. But tidings from the north and the east will what? Will shake him up. And when he hears these tidings from the north and the east, he's going to what? He's going to go and try and destroy and make away, utterly eradicate a certain group of people. And then he plants the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain to deliver a death blow. But when he's going to do that, he comes to his end, and he has no one to help him. That's the sequence of events in Daniel 11. Now, I said that Ellen White would comment on Daniel 11:40 to 45 in the chapters before the chapter on the time of trouble. Right? Now, what do you find in the chapters, say the 5 or 6 chapters before the chapter on the time of trouble? Let me describe what you find in the writings of Ellen White, and I'll go through this quickly. She speaks about the wounding of the Roman Catholic papacy in the French Revolution. By the way, that is the attack on the king of the north, to try and destroy him. Then she speaks about how the wound begins to heal, and this system begins to take over the world. Then she describes that the papacy enters the United States, overtakes the United States, particularly Protestantism as represented in the United States. That's the entering the glorious land, by the way. Then she describes how the papacy ascends to global power. And how when crunch time comes, many who have been in the remnant church will be overcome by this system and will abandon the remnant church. But she says that many will escape from the hand of this power and join God's remnant people. That's what's being described in Daniel 11. By the king of the north overcoming some, but some escaping from his hand. It's really describing the shaking. Then she describes how a national and finally a universal Sunday law will be proclaimed. And God's people will proclaim the message about the Sabbath, about the seal of God. By the way, do you know that in Revelation chapter 18, where it speaks about the angel that comes from heaven, that glorious angel that comes from heaven, fills the earth with his glory, condemns Babylon because Babylon is filled with demons and fornicates with the kings of the earth. In other words, it's mixing church and state. Do you know, interestingly enough, that message comes from heaven, and in the Bible, heaven is in the north. And in Revelation 7, the sealing of God's people, by the way, the seal is what? God's holy Sabbath. The sealing takes place by an angel that comes from the east. Tidings from the north and from the what? The east, concerning God's law, concerning the Sabbath. And what is that going to do with the religious powers of the world? They are going to become what? Infuriated, just like it says in Daniel chapter 11. The message that comes from the north and the east will infuriate the world. And then probation will close. And a death decree will be proclaimed against God's people. That's what's being described by the king of the north setting up his strategic tents in a place between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. He's in a strategic place in the valley of Megiddo, where all of the principal battles took place against literal Israel. In other words, he's gathering in a strategic place to deliver a final death blow against God's people. Only at the end, it's not going to be on a local level, it's going to be what? Global or worldwide. Is there going to be a terrible time of trouble which will ensue according to Ellen White? Yes, absolutely. Are God's people going to be delivered from this death decree? She describes it. Then there's going to be a special resurrection, and then Christ will set up his everlasting kingdom. So let me ask you, is Ellen White silent on Daniel 11:40-45? She's not silent about it. She has much to say. She takes the symbols, and what does she do? She interprets them. She does much like we did with the 24 elders. Remember what we did with the 24 elders? You know, it speaks there about... It speaks about 4 living creatures. It speaks about 24 elders. It speaks about a lamb, as though he had been slain, and one seated on the throne. None of them are identified. In Revelation 4 and 5, they're not identified. It just says there's one sitting on the throne, there's 24 elders, there's 4 living creatures, and there's a lamb as if he had been slain. All you have is symbols. But when Ellen White talks about this in Desire of Ages, the last 3 chapters of Desire of Ages, she says, the 4 living creatures are seraphim. She doesn't even say 4 living creatures. She says the seraphim are there. Instead of the 24 elders, she says the representatives, the sons of God, the representatives of the worlds that never sinned are there. She doesn't even mention the 24 elders, but she says the representatives of the worlds. Instead of speaking about the lamb as though he'd been slain, she never even quotes that verse. She says Jesus. And instead of speaking about one sitting on the throne, she says, Jesus approaches the Father. Ellen White is giving, in matter-of-fact language, the meaning of the symbols of Revelation 4 and 5. And that's what she's doing in Daniel 11:40-45. And I don't even think maybe Ellen White knew what she was doing. She knew what she was saying, obviously. But I'm not sure that she knew she was commenting in the chapters before the chapter on the time of trouble, that she was even commenting on events that are described in Daniel 11, verses 40-45. Now allow me to bring this to a close. Are you understanding so far? This is a real global view. We're doing all right. A lot of Adventist scholars today are saying, how come fundamentalist Islam is not in end-time prophecy? We have to find Islam. It's far too important to not be in Bible prophecy. How many times does Ellen White mention Islam as being important in end-time events? None. In none of these chapters does she mention Islam as being important in the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. She doesn't even mention it. For her, the dangerous powers are the civil powers of the world uniting with the Roman Catholic papacy and apostate Protestantism. The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet of Revelation chapter 13, Revelation chapter 16. Those are the powers that she comments about. Nothing about Islam. So why do futurists today believe that the king of the south are the Arabs and the king of the north is Russia? And the kings from the east are the Chinese. And they're going to come against literal Israel. And there's going to be this fight over the oil of the Middle East. Anti-Semitic battle between the powers of the world and the Jews. Does Ellen White have anything to say about this? No, because she's following historicist principles. She's following the historical flow method. By the way, it's very dangerous for us to get our interpretation of prophecy from newspapers, movies, books, and television. It's been tried before in the Seventh-day Adventist Church by a man called Uriah Smith, who in many ways was a great scholar. He has many things of value. But in 1871, Turkey was in the news. And there was the idea that Turkey was going to transfer its capital to Jerusalem. And then Turkey was going to be destroyed in Jerusalem between the seas and the Holy Mountain. And that was what it was in the news. And so Uriah Smith, you know, when they were talking about transferring the capital of Turkey, he says, no, Turkey has to be in the Bible somewhere. Where? Oh, here it is, the king of the north. Is that any way to interpret Bible prophecy? To let the newspapers tell you what the Bible means? No. You go to the Bible and understand the Bible, and then you read the newspapers. Are you following me? And so Uriah Smith changed the interpretation of the king of the north. And for decades, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the evangelists and the scholars were teaching that Turkey was the king of the north. Now you tell me, how can you have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, in Daniel 2, in Daniel 7, in Daniel 8, but in Daniel 11 you have Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, papal Rome, and Turkey. How does that follow any biblical principles? It's a violation of biblical principles. Allow me to close by reading you one statement from James White, the husband of Ellen White. He says this: if the feet and 10 toes of the metallic image are Roman, if the beast with the 10 horns that was given to the burning of the flames of the great day be the Roman beast, if the little horn which stood up against the prince of princes be Rome, and if the same field and distance are covered by these 4 prophetic chains, then the last power of the 11th chapter, which is to come to his end and none shall help him, is Rome. Are you catching this logic? But if this be Turkey, as some teach, then the toes of the image of the 2nd chapter are Turkish. The beast with the 10 horns of the 7th chapter represents Turkey. And it was Turkey that stood up against the Prince of Princes in the 8th chapter of Daniel. The dangerous powers in this world, folks, are when the kings of the earth allow the Roman Catholic papacy to ascend to power again. Aided by the United States of America, the very country that God chose to separate church and state. The very country that incorporated into its Bill of Rights, in the amendments of the Constitution, that Congress shall establish no law, shall make no law, respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The character of the United States is going to change when it caters to the papacy. And then God's people who speak out will be marked. That is reality. And even in the Adventist Church, many are trying to change this view. May God help us to proclaim the correct view, because there are many sincere people that are hungry and thirsting for the truth, and they need to know it. Let us pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for what we've been able to study this evening. We ask, Lord, that you will give us the opportunities and help us keep our eyes open to looking for chances to witness to people about these great things from your word. We thank you for having been with us in this series, and we ask that you will bless us as we return to our homes. We pray these things in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.